As I was thinking about diving into this book, I was asking myself the question, what does it take to be a hero? Right? And like if you ask people today what their favorite heroes are, a lot of them are going to name off superheroes, right? Like Superman, Black Panther, T'Challa, or the new one. Is it too soon to say the new one's name? Is that a spoiler? Has everyone seen it?
I've not seen it.
Oh.
It's probably the one who died in the last movie. What?
No, it's not.
Yeah, that's not how it works. Like, yeah. Anyway, Wonder Woman, Iron Man, whatever. Shazam. Shazam's cool.
Shazam is the best.
No, now I'm just naming off heroes people like. All right. Who's your favorite hero?
Mine?
Shazam.
Spider-Man.
Jesus.
Spider-Man. Spider-Man. Peter Parker.
Yeah, right.
I'm talking this side of the room.
Steal your whole lesson right there.
That's not even the hero I'm going after today, but yeah, it is kind of the Sunday school Jesus. Mine is Green Lantern, not the Green Lantern movie, but Green Lantern in the comic books.
Green Lantern.
It's pretty cool. Yeah, no, he has like a power ring. He uses his imagination, makes stuff. What?
He has the worst movie.
Yeah, I said not the movie, the comic books. The comic books are amazing. All right. Here's the thing. We get that heroes in the real world don't wear capes and stuff, right? Like, I was looking through the news, and a few years back, this group of guys, I don't know why they didn't publish a photo with their faces, but these kids out in Colorado, they were at their baseball practice, and they heard some screaming from the parking lot, and so they jumped the fence and went running to the parking lot to see what happened. This mom had accidentally run over her daughter. What? Yeah. And the car, she was like pinned under she's alive. Okay, this is a hero story. They said, but these kids jumped the fence, run over, and they all lifted up the car together while their coach pulled the girl from under the car, saved her life. Here's my favorite part though. Here's what the coach said about it when he was being interviewed. To be honest, we might not have the best baseball team around, but we sure do have a great group of guys. I was like, what kind of self-own is that? Oh my gosh. Hey, so we're going to spend the next few weeks looking at a Jewish hero that is celebrated every year in the Festival of Purim. To this day, Jewish people, this is one of their favorite people to celebrate. Every year they celebrate now for thousands of years the story of Esther, and part of it is like they read it out loud and they boo and they cheer and they make noisemakers. It's like they're going to the Rocky Horror movie picture, but none of you should see that. And they make a whole deal of it. If you got that, it means you've seen it, and that's not appropriate, dude. Okay. I'm just kidding. Here's the deal. Esther lived about 2,400 years ago. And it was during a time when the Jewish people had been conquered by the Persians. We've actually done a few Old Testament books during kind of that time period where they were conquered by the Persians. And so the book opens with the Persian king, King Xerxes, throwing a 6-month-long party just to show off how rich he was. 6 months, they're partying every day. He's just blowing all sorts of money on it. People are going crazy. And when the party finished and most of the people went home, he threw a week-long after party to celebrate the party they just had, where he literally made an edict that said they were not allowed to shut anyone off on the alcohol, right? Like no shutting anyone down. He was like, I want to get lit. Not appropriate. Don't do this kind of behavior. They just get totally, it was a rager, right? And in Esther verse 1, chapter 1, verses 10 through 12, it says, on the 7th day of the feast, so the after party, the 7th day of the 7-day after party, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, that's Bible language for like drunk out of his mind, he told the 7 eunuchs who do you guys know what a eunuch is? Yeah. Danielle's nodding. Somebody else said yes. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here, because there's a lot of eunuchs in the book of Esther. I feel like we need to know what they are. So I'm not going to get too graphic, but here's the deal. You know how like sometimes you buy a dog or a cat and it's a dude and you take it to the vet and get it neutered and like they fix it. I don't know why I had to.
Snip, snip.
That's what a eunuch was. Like they neutered the dude, like a grown dude, just cut him off. It was not for fun. There was no painkillers back then. There was no anesthesia. It was just a painful surgery. And essentially the thought was these dudes are working around the king and the king's wives, and they didn't want any like unplanned parties happening between the king's dudes and the king's wives. And people didn't really volunteer for this job, Trevor. It wasn't like a, hey, can I be a eunuch? It was like they would capture them from somewhere, do the surgery, and then they had this job. So it wasn't a great scenario. That's not really the point of today's lesson. Okay? I just needed us to understand that word because I'm always going to jump at opportunities to make it uncomfortable. So the king, he's drunk out of his mind. He tells the 7 eunuchs who attended him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. I don't know how they came up with these names back in the day. To bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men, all these other guys that are drunk out of their minds, to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. And here's the deal. Like, why is she being so mean? He just wants to say hi. No, that's not what's going on here, right? Like, we kind of romanticize kings and queens. Everybody was watching on TV a little while back when King Charles got to become king. And I remember, like, when his first wedding, it was like one of the biggest TV events. And we love watching Kings and Kings. We're all enamored with that. We make movies about meeting Prince Charming or Princess this or that or whatever. That's not really how it was 2,400 years ago. Even the queen was in a lot of ways didn't have rights like a man did 2,400 years ago. It's not right. But women in general were viewed as just property belonging to their dad or to their husband or whatever. And same with the queen. The queen was essentially property of her husband. He had a bunch of wives, and she just happened to be the highest ranking one, but whatever. And so she had to know she was taking a big risk by refusing him. Like, we're going to find out later in the book of Esther, like, he'll have no problem putting someone to death, even if he's married to him. And so there had to be a reason why she was refusing him. And why did she do it? There's a few reasons that scholars think when they look at the culture of the day and what the language meant and what they were expecting. And there's a few possible reasons. The first was, this was a men's-only party, right? When the noblemen would get this drunk, their wives weren't supposed to be around. Like, women of high status should not be present. Now, it didn't mean they didn't have, like, serving girls there and dancing ladies there. It was not an appropriate party, right? But there's certainly an aspect to it where, like, culturally, it would have been incredibly dishonorable for her to appear in front of all these dudes when they were drunk. More significantly, a lot of scholars think it's really interesting that he says, bring Queen Vashti with the royal crown on her head. They think what he was actually saying is bring Queen Vashti with nothing but the royal crown on her head. That he wanted to parade her around naked in front of all of his friends and be like, check out how pretty my wife is. It's really offensive. So it kind of makes it like, yo, Jewel. I'm the one talking now. I'm just saying. It really kind of makes it a little bit more like, oh, that's why she didn't want to show up in front of a bunch of drunk dudes naked. Like, that's not a very honorable thing for the queen. And so, like, is anybody else starting to think maybe this king is a little bit of a pig? Like, a little bit, Trevor, he gets it. Like, already, he's all into massive drunken parties that just go on with no end. He's not respecting women. It's like, it's not a great thing. Well, he's furious. And so a couple verses later, the king is talking to his other drunk friends, and he goes, "What must be done to Queen Vashti?" the king demanded. "What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly sent through his eunuchs?" Okay? Like he's going, "I'm the king. I gave an order. She's supposed to do it. What am I supposed to do about it?" And then his ridiculous drunk friends say this. Memucan answered the king and his nobles, "Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but every noble and citizen throughout your empire." He's like making this a global issue that the queen didn't want to come disrespect herself. He goes, "Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger." This guy is going like, for the sake of every man out there, you got to get your wife in order or we're all going to have a hard time with our wives. It's not, like, to be clear, just because this is recorded in the Bible doesn't mean this is how it's supposed to be, right? Like these are the bad guys saying bad things about women. This is not great. And this guy is like, he's like essentially going, "Dude, like women are going to start thinking they can think for themselves. This is not good." It was not a great thing. So they're all disgusting. And so these guys come up with a proposal for how we can remedy women just going rogue all over the place. He says, "So if it pleases the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published through the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives." So the king hears this and goes, "That's a great plan." So right then and there, he didn't wait till he sobered up or anything. Like, never make big decisions. First off, don't get drunk. But don't make big decisions while you're drunk. So he sends out the letters right then and there. And he banishes the queen. We don't know what happens to her. Like, we do know in a culture back then, an unattached woman, this isn't right, but an unattached woman really didn't have much rights or safety or security. So however Queen Vashti's life ended up, which we don't know, it probably wasn't great. But she's banished. She's kicked out. She's gone. This dude is just so classy. Then he gets sober. And he gets a little bummed out. He's like, "Oh man, I banished my favorite wife in front of everyone. Now I can't undo it." He fought a war for a couple of years because he's a grouchy dude. Time is going on. A few years is going on. And he's getting bummed. He doesn't have a queen anymore. He still has other wives and whatever, but no queen. And so his people say to him in chapter 2, verse 2, "Let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king." Which seems oddly specific. If you don't know what the word virgin means, we're just not going to get into that today. I know, this one isn't on the slide. This one I was just saying. I was afraid. I didn't know how you'd handle it with the word virgin just right up there. That's what I'm talking about. Like, I'm saying it, and Micah's kind of like, his eyes are bugging out.
I don't know what it means. I'm just
You can ask your parents. Here's the deal. There's a few things going on here. First off, they believed, I know, I said the virgin word, and now I've lost half the room. Let's get it together, people. We're not middle schoolers. We can do this. We're going to get through this together. So they say to him, they're like, "Hey, man, let's go find a young virgin for you. She can become the queen. It'll be great." And they're going to find beautiful young virgins for him to choose from. And I think there's a few things we should know here. First off, they believed only a virgin could marry a king. They didn't feel like the king had to be a virgin to marry her. So that was a little lack of equity there, but whatever. Secondly, by enjoy, when they said, they're going, "We want you to we're going to bring all these different virgins in, all these young virgins. You enjoy them. Whichever one you enjoy the most becomes the queen." By enjoy, Daniel gets it. He meant sleep with them, right? Third, it's just going to get worse from here. Third, by young virgins, they really didn't mean young. Like they were probably around 14 years old. Here's why. Back in the day, the average marrying age was like 12 to 14 years old for a girl, 14 to 17 years old for a dude. This still happens in parts of the world. Like I've lived in countries where people are getting married as teenagers. It's strange to us in our culture. Enrique looked shocked because in our culture, the average marrying age is more like 20s and 30s, right? I haven't done any weddings for a 14-year-old yet. Not planning on it. So for them to be virgins means they're not married yet, which means they're probably 14 or so. Hey, back row. Come on. Let me make it a little bit creepier. We also know, because the book of Esther opens with what year it is, and we know when King Xerxes reigned and everything else, by the time he marries Esther, who would have been around 14, he was probably close to 40 years old.
Red card.
Yeah, red card is right. This guy, he's a predator. So he hears this plan, and his response is, that's a good plan. So yeah, he's just a dirty old dude. One commentator wrote out, because here's the thing, some people, they read this and they don't know these cultural parts, right? They haven't done the history, they haven't read up to find, and so they just read Esther and they hear them called young women, because back then they called somebody who was 14 a woman. They picture this like this was The Bachelor, right? Where he brings in a bunch of women and they have a competition, they go on some dates. No, that's the problem with, like, we have to be careful of reading something through our cultural lens. We try to make it make sense with things we're familiar with. This was nothing like this. One commentator said parents probably, quote, sought to hide their daughters from the lecherous monarch. Which brings us to the introduction of our hero. In chapter 2, we finally get to Esther in the book of Esther. It says, at that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, the name of that town, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, so he was a Jewish guy, was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family had been among those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, going like their family was kicked out when Babylon conquered, before Persia did, whatever. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, that was her Jewish name, who was also called Esther. That was her Persian name. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. Esther was an orphan. She had lost her national freedom to the Persians. She had lost her parents to death, and now she's about to lose any say in her future. Because in verses 8 and 9 it says, as a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Haggai's care. What we're going to learn is this king had two harems. He had the harem where the girls were brought to first, because they were essentially all his wives, whether they wanted to be or not. They were brought there, and then they were prepared. They would go through like 6 months of beauty treatments. It didn't matter if they wanted to or not. It was essentially like, we're taking these common girls and we're going to make them feel like royalty to the king or whatever. I don't know. So it was all these like scents and feeding them the right foods so they were like healthy and whatever. It's just, and so some people try to paint it like they were all trying to happily use their bodies to try and become the queen. That's not what was going on. The deal is, if Esther, if these men, like it's very clear from the ancient Hebrew language, these girls were taken. They weren't volunteering, right? If Esther had said, when the men came around to try and collect her, and they're like, you're coming with us to be a potential queen, and Esther was like, yeah, no, I'm not really feeling that, they would have said, all right, well, the answer to saying no is we're going to kill you and your family. So if she had refused, she would have been put to death. Mordecai would have been put to death. And if Mordecai had any other children or wife or whatever, we don't know, if there was any other family, they would have been put to death too. They didn't have a choice. So she's put in this harem, and she's under the care of this eunuch, another eunuch, Haggai. And here's what's interesting to me. It says, Haggai, in verse 9, was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Something about Esther's character stood out to Haggai. Like when Haggai, because Haggai's a eunuch, he doesn't have any testosterone going on anymore. Like he isn't there going like, I like her, let's hook her up. No, Haggai's going, there was something about her character, something about the type of person that she was that immediately stood out, which I think is important. Like even the king, this isn't about, like he's just a creepy old dude that liked taking all these girls. But something else about Esther is going to stand out. And so Haggai is in charge of getting these girls ready. And when the time would come, they would be allowed to pick out what they wanted to wear, and then they would send them to the king, just essentially a different girl every night to this king. And then it says that evening, just speaking in general, this is about Esther, what the process was, the girls, she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem, where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. What's the second harem? The second harem is where, like, I don't know how to say this not bluntly. This king was just this creepy predator who liked taking the virginity from young girls, essentially raping them, and then he would place them in the second harem, because once he had done that, he wasn't interested in them anymore. And because they were no longer able to be married to anyone else, because the king had slept with them, they were his property, they would just go to this other building to die, and they would live a nice lifestyle, but they were essentially prisoners in this second harem. They didn't even get to mix with the wives that didn't get to go yet, right? Like, it was just, it's really kind of a sad and disturbing thing. It feels much more like human trafficking than it does auditioning to become the queen, right? So, and this is what Esther has been taken into. And here's the deal. Just because in the culture they were viewed that way, as kind of like used or broken and sent to this other palace, doesn't mean that God views women that way, right? Like when God sees people with all of our different backgrounds, all the different things we've gone through, he looks at us, sees us as beautiful, as masterpieces, as children that he loves beyond compare. It's super fascinating to me that in Jesus' genealogy, in the Gospel of Matthew, that long list of names, which most people skip because it's like, why do we need to hear all these names? In the Jewish tradition, you would put the list of names in a genealogy that kind of enhanced the story of the person that the genealogy was about. That, like, these are all the names that make this person even better. So they would actually not include names of, like, embarrassing relatives. It would be all the cool relatives. And you never, no offense, ladies, you would never put a woman's name in a genealogy because women just didn't matter. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying in the culture a couple thousand years ago, that's what they thought. So women's names were never included in genealogies, but in Jesus' genealogy, Matthew includes Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, and Bathsheba, and all 4 of them have stories that had aspects to them that made people uncomfortable, like about because they were victims of sexual assault or rape, or Rahab was a prostitute, or just these different elements of their past that most people would have been like, ooh. But God was like, no, their presence makes Jesus' story that much better. Like God saw so much more in each one of them. And I think, like, whenever we talk about somebody being treated like this in the Bible, I think it's very important for us to be like, but that isn't the way God wants it or the way God views that person's worth. So in God's eyes, each of these girls that get sent to this second harem have incredible value. They were his precious children. A couple verses later, it's Esther's turn. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. Again, some people have tried to be like, yeah, because Esther really used her body to wow him and whatever. No. She was a kid, it was a virgin, no experience, whatever. It was something else about her, something about her character, something about, how sometimes you meet someone and it just shines through that there is something different and special about this person, and you can't even necessarily put your finger on it. That's what's going on here with this king. The king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor for all his nobles and officials, declaring a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. And normally in stories we read, becoming the queen is the happily ever after part of the story. I don't think this was such a happy moment for Esther. She was probably relieved that she wasn't, being put to death, but it was still just a traumatic experience after traumatic experience after traumatic experience. And what I think is interesting is when you look at the book of Esther, I'd challenge you to be reading it on your own these weeks. It's masterfully written. It's one of the best books in the Bible, just even from a story perspective. And the author, when he wrote it, really set it up the way we would structure a movie today, right? That the opening was the setup. Then there's the confrontation. That's coming next week. And then the resolution, which we'll look at in the final week. We're only in the first week, but this is setting the ground. This is kind of like Esther's origin story before she becomes the hero. Now, here's what I just have a couple last little things I want to say to think about. Because what do we even do with all of this for our lives today? Because I think one of our goals when we look at Scripture is what can we learn from this? And it reminds me, in Genesis 5:20, Joseph went through a similar thing where he was sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he gets falsely accused, so he's in prison. But eventually, the story works out to where he gets to a place of power and position where he's able to then save his family. And he says to his brothers when they come to him, they're afraid because they sold him into slavery. He goes, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." This king, the attendants, all these people that put Esther into this position, none of them meant that for the good of Esther, right? It was all about how can we make the king happy so he's happy with that. They were using Esther to make the king happy. The king was using all of these girls, right? That he really was just a predator who was taking advantage of their lack of power and his total power. And yet, even though all of them intended these for bad things, what we're going to see is that God is going to use this to give Esther the opportunity to save the lives of all of her people. Suffering can be an opportunity for growth. Going through difficult times can be an opportunity for something good to happen. In Romans 5:3-4, it's on your paper, Paul writes, "We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials. For we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation." So on your paper, if you want to do the fill-in, I put the question, what's the good that can come from suffering? And I think we see some of the answers to that in this verse. That we develop endurance. That as we suffer, but we turn to God, we develop endurance to get through that suffering. That then, because of that endurance, we develop strength of character. How many of you have seen someone who's gone through really difficult times and endured and handled it well? We're frequently impressed with their character. There's just something going on there. There's a strength of character. There's an ability to empathize with others. There's an ability to trust God even when it doesn't make sense. And because of that endurance, because of that strength of character, because of seeing God work through something, even though it's not going well, and sometimes we get the happy ending to the story, but sometimes we don't find out how God is working out to good until after we die and we're in heaven and can finally ask him, like, what was the deal with the suffering back then? But as we see God work, it strengthens our hope of salvation. Like, I know 47-year-old me has much more confidence in the hope I have for salvation than I did when I was your age or in my mid-20s or even in my 30s, because over time, as I've had different moments where I've seen God work or help or deliver, that I've gotten through a difficult time, and then I look back and see the ways that God did stuff, it gives me hope that if he can work in these situations, then ultimately he can deliver on his promise of salvation. So, before we close in prayer, regardless of what your past is, regardless of what others may have done to you, like Esther was very much a victim of what was going on, or that you've done, the story of Esther demonstrates powerfully that God sees incredible value in each of us, right? Regardless of our past, he sees value and worth, that he has a purpose for each of us. God can and will give you endurance, character, and hope. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for the story of Esther. We thank you so much for what we can learn about what it means to follow you even in difficult and overwhelming and impossible moments. God, I ask that you would help us to lean on you for endurance, for character, for hope. That you would give each of us wisdom this week as we go to school or work or wherever it is that we are, that you would help us to use each opportunity and each day to serve you and bring glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen.